He thought spending his last $8,500 on a crumbling warehouse was the desperate act of a broken man. But what Marcus found buried beneath the concrete floor would prove that sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of a miracle worth $230 million. Before we dive into this incredible journey, make sure to smash that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The morning mist clung to the abandoned factories like ghosts refusing to leave, rolling across the broken asphalt and rusted chain-link fences that marked the boundaries of dreams long dead. Marcus Riley stood at the edge of the Hartwell Industrial Complex, his breath visible in the November cold, his prosthetic leg throbbing with the familiar ache that came before every storm. At 34, he carried the weight of someone much older: 3 tours in Afghanistan, 14 months in Walter Reed Medical Center, and 2 years of trying to figure out what came after the uniform. The warehouse loomed in front of him like a sleeping giant, red brick darkened by decades of weather, steel-framed windows that reflected nothing but gray sky and broken promises. The building stretched 300 feet along the abandoned railway line, its loading dock cracked and overgrown with weeds that had pushed through concrete with the patience of years. A faded sign hung crooked above the main entrance: Hartwell Industrial Park, established 1957. Below it, someone had spray-painted "Dead End" in block letters that had run in the rain. But it was $8,500. And that was almost exactly what Marcus had left. He shifted his weight, feeling the familiar click of titanium against bone, where his right leg ended just below the knee. The prosthetic was military-grade, state-of-the-art, designed to let him run and jump and climb like he used to. But 2 years after the IED had torn through his Humvee outside Kandahar, he still couldn't get used to the way it made him feel like a man made of spare parts, held together by medical tape and stubborn pride. The real estate agent, Beth Kowalski, emerged from a silver Honda Civic that had seen better decades, her heels clicking against the cracked pavement as she approached the gate. She wore a business suit that was trying too hard, and carried a leather briefcase that had probably cost more than Marcus made in a month when he was still getting paid. "Mr. Riley." She extended a manicured hand, her smile practiced and professionally warm. "Beth Kowalski, Kowalski Properties. I have to say, I'm surprised you wanted to see this place. Most buyers take one look at the listing photos and move on." Marcus shook her hand, noting the way her eyes flicked quickly to his leg, then away. People always did that: tried not to stare, failed, then overcompensated with aggressive eye contact that felt more awkward than honest curiosity would have been. "I'm not most buyers," he said simply. Beth fumbled with a ring of keys that looked like it could unlock half the empty buildings in the industrial district. The padlock was newer than everything else about the property, bright steel against rust-stained chain link. As she worked the lock, she kept up the kind of nervous chatter that real estate agents use to fill uncomfortable silences. The previous owner, Harrison Volk, had this place for 32 years, ran some kind of metals business out of it. Scrap dealers, you know. Buy low, sell high, that sort of thing. The lock clicked open, and she pulled the chain free with the relief of someone who'd been half expecting it not to work. He just walked away from it 5 years ago, left it to the county for unpaid taxes. Been sitting empty ever since. Marcus followed her through the gate, gravel crunching under their feet. The closer they got to the building, the more substantial it looked. The brick was solid, the foundation intact, the roof sagging in only one corner. It was neglected, not destroyed, the kind of place that could be saved with enough work and enough reason. "What happened to Volk?" Marcus asked, as Beth searched for the right key to the main entrance. "Died about 6 months after he abandoned the place." She found the key and slid it into the lock with the satisfaction of small victories. "Heart attack, from what I heard. No family. No will. No one to claim the property. That's why it went to auction." The heavy steel door opened with a groan that seemed to come from deep within the building itself, and stale air rushed out, carrying the scent of dust and motor oil. And something else, something metallic that Marcus couldn't quite identify. Beth reached inside and flipped a switch, flooding the entrance with harsh fluorescent light. "Electricity's still on," she said with surprise. "That's unusual. Most of these abandoned places get cut off pretty quick." They stepped inside, and Marcus felt the weight of the space settle around him like a heavy coat. The warehouse was vast, easily 20,000 square feet of open concrete floor, broken only by steel support columns that rose to a ceiling lost in shadows. Along the walls, empty metal shelving units stood like skeletal remains of whatever business Volk had operated here. The air was thick with dust motes that danced in the shafts of light falling through skylights, dirty enough to filter sunshine into something grey and melancholy. 23,000 square feet total, Beth said, her voice echoing in the emptiness. Main floor, small office complex upstairs, loading dock with hydraulic lift in the back. 3-phase electrical throughout, though I can't guarantee all of it works. Heating system is oil-fired. Probably needs work. Marcus walked deeper into the space, his footsteps echoing with the sharp click of his prosthetic against concrete. The sound seemed to go on forever, bouncing off walls and ceiling until it became a rhythm step. Click, step, click, step, click. The warehouse felt like a cathedral of abandonment, vast and hollow, and somehow sacred in its emptiness. Near the center of the floor, he stopped and looked around. Light fell through the dirty skylights in long columns, illuminating patches of concrete that were stained dark with oil and marked with the shadows of machinery long since removed. But there was something about the place that called to him, not just the size or the price, but the silence. After 2 years of VA hospitals and physical therapy clinics and support group meetings filled with well-meaning voices asking how he was adjusting, the silence felt like a gift. "What kind of metals business was it?" Marcus asked. Beth consulted a folder thick with legal documents and property records. "Precious metals, mostly. Gold, silver, platinum. He had licenses for buying and selling, melting and refining. Pretty comprehensive operation from the looks of it." She paused, looking around at the empty space. Must have been successful. This place would have cost serious money to outfit properly. Marcus walked to one of the empty shelving units and ran his hand along the steel. It was heavy-duty industrial shelving, the kind designed to hold serious weight. Each shelf was rated for 2,000 pounds, according to the manufacturer's label still visible on the frame. Whatever Volk had been storing here, it had been substantial. In the far corner, a small office complex was built into the main floor like a ship's bridge. Windows on 3 sides, offering a view of the entire warehouse floor. Marcus climbed the metal stairs, his prosthetic ringing against each step, and peered through the grimy windows. The office was empty, except for a few metal filing cabinets and a desk that looked like it had been built to survive nuclear war. "Storage room down here," Beth called from the main floor, her voice echoing up to him. "Looks like it might have been a safe room or something. Heavy door, thick walls." Marcus descended the stairs and found Beth standing beside what looked like a vault door. 3 inches of steel set into a concrete frame, with the kind of locking mechanism that belonged in a bank rather than a warehouse. The door stood open, revealing a room about 10 feet by 12 feet with concrete walls and no windows. Metal shelving units lined the walls, all of them empty. But Marcus could see scuff marks on the floor where heavy objects had been dragged in and out repeatedly. "Serious security for a scrap dealer," he observed. Beth nodded, making notes on her legal pad. "The whole place is wired for security cameras, though they're all gone now. Must have been quite an operation." They spent another hour walking through the building. Marcus asked questions about utilities, taxes, zoning restrictions, the practical concerns of someone seriously considering a purchase. But his mind kept returning to that vault room and the heavy-duty shelving and the metallic smell that seemed to permeate everything. When they finished the tour, Beth locked up and walked him back to their cars. The November wind had picked up, carrying the promise of an early winter, and Marcus pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders. "Can I ask what you're planning to do with it?" Beth said as she opened her car door. "If you don't mind my asking, it's just this isn't exactly a residential neighborhood, and you don't strike me as the industrial type." Marcus looked back at the warehouse, its brick walls now lit by the pale afternoon sun. "I'm not sure yet," he said honestly. "Maybe I just need somewhere to think." Beth smiled for the first time since they'd met, and it looked genuine rather than professional. "Sometimes that's the most important thing," she said. "Thinking space. God knows there's plenty of room for it in there." After she drove away, Marcus stood alone in the parking lot, listening to the wind whistle through the broken windows of the abandoned factory next door. The industrial district stretched around him like a graveyard of American manufacturing buildings that had once hummed with productivity, now standing empty, their windows broken, their parking lots cracked and overgrown. But this warehouse was different. It was empty, but not broken, abandoned, but not destroyed. It felt like a pause between chapters, rather than an ending. Marcus pulled out his phone and called the number on Beth's business card. She answered on the second ring. "I'll take it," he said without preamble. There was a pause. "Are you sure? You haven't even seen a full property inspection." Or, "I'm sure," Marcus interrupted. "As is. $8,500. "Well," Beth said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "That was easy. I'll draw up the paperwork." That night, Marcus sat in his studio apartment across town, staring at the purchase agreement Beth had emailed him. The apartment was a month-to-month rental in a building that had been modern sometime around 1970, with thin walls and thinner carpet, and neighbors who watched television too loud and fought too often. Everything he owned fit into 3 duffel bags and a plastic storage container: clothes, books, his army medals in a box he'd opened exactly once since coming home, and a framed photo of his squad from his second deployment. Half the men in that photo were dead. 3 had been killed in the same explosion that took his leg. 2 more had died in separate incidents during their 3rd tour. 1 had made it home only to lose his own battle with PTSD 6 months later. The survivors were scattered across the country now, trying to build new lives from whatever pieces they had left. Marcus set the photo aside and focused on the purchase agreement. The legal language was dense and formal, but the essential facts were simple. For $8,500, he would own 23,000 square feet of industrial space, in a city that was slowly dying, but not yet dead. It wasn't much of a future, but it was his. He signed the documents and emailed them back to Beth, then lay on his air mattress and listened to the sounds of the building around him. Footsteps overhead, muffled television through the walls, the wheeze and rattle of heating pipes that had been struggling for decades. In 2 weeks, he would leave all of this behind and move into a warehouse that smelled of motor oil and secrets. For the first time in 2 years, Marcus Riley felt something that might have been hope. The morning of the closing dawned grey and cold, with the kind of November wind that cut through clothing and found every gap in a man's defenses. Marcus packed his truck, the same beat-up Ford Ranger he'd bought with cash when he got out of the hospital, and drove across town to Beth's office. The title company was located in a strip mall between a tax preparation service and a shop that sold medical equipment, as if the entire complex had been designed to serve people dealing with life's more complicated paperwork. Beth was waiting for him with a stack of documents that seemed disproportionately large for such a simple transaction. She had him sign his name so many times that his signature began to lose meaning, becoming just a series of marks that represented his commitment to something he wasn't entirely sure he understood. "Congratulations," she said as she handed him the keys, 2 brass keys on a ring that was already green with age. "You now own the most interesting property I've sold all year." Marcus pocketed the keys and shook her hand. "Interesting? How? Most people buy property because they know what they want to do with it," she said. "You bought it because you needed to own something. That's either very wise or very dangerous, possibly both." An hour later, Marcus stood alone in his warehouse, surrounded by silence and possibility. The afternoon light fell through the skylights in long shafts that revealed dust dancing in the air like snow. His footsteps echoed as he walked the perimeter, checking windows, testing light switches, getting a feel for the space that was now his. The building felt different as an owner than it had as a potential buyer. Every crack in the concrete, every stain on the walls, every piece of equipment left behind was now his responsibility. But rather than feeling overwhelmed, Marcus felt grounded for the first time since leaving the army. This wasn't someone else's space that he was borrowing or renting, this was his. Bought and paid for with money he'd earned through his own blood and sacrifice. In the far corner of the warehouse, he found the room that would become his living space. It was about 12 feet by 15 feet, originally designed as some kind of break room or small office. There was a window that looked out over the loading dock, a concrete floor that was level and solid, and enough electrical outlets to handle basic needs. It wasn't much, but Marcus had lived in much worse during his deployments. He spent the rest of the day moving his possessions from the apartment to the warehouse, 3 trips in the Ford Ranger, and his entire civilian life was transferred from a studio apartment to a corner of an industrial building. He set up his air mattress against one wall, arranged his clothes in plastic storage bins, and plugged in the small refrigerator he'd bought used from a Craigslist ad. As evening approached, Marcus made his first meal in his new home, a can of chili heated on a camping stove, eaten while sitting on a folding chair and looking out over the vast, empty space that belonged to him. The warehouse felt larger at night, the shadows deeper, the silence more complete. Outside, he could hear the distant hum of traffic and the occasional train whistle from the rail yard 2 miles away. But inside everything was still. For dinner entertainment, he explored the building more thoroughly than he had during the initial tour. He found things Beth hadn't mentioned, a small workshop area with a pegboard, still holding tools, a bathroom with industrial fixtures that looked like they could withstand artillery bombardment, and in one corner, a section of floor where the concrete was a slightly different color, as if it had been poured at a different time. Marcus knelt and ran his hand over the mismatched concrete. It was smooth, level with the rest of the floor, but definitely newer. The color difference was subtle gray, instead of the weathered brown of the original pour, but noticeable once you looked for it. The patch was roughly 10 feet by 10 feet, positioned near one of the load-bearing columns. He tapped the floor with his knuckles, listening to the sound. Most of the warehouse floor produced a solid, dull thud when struck. But this section sounded different, not hollow exactly, but not as solid as the surrounding concrete. There was a resonance to it, a slight echo that suggested something beneath. Marcus spent the next hour tapping his way around the patch, mapping its boundaries by sound. The anomaly was contained within the discolored area, suggesting that whatever was underneath had been deliberately covered when the new concrete was poured. But what could be hidden under a warehouse floor? And why would someone go to the trouble of digging it up and sealing it again? As midnight approached, Marcus gave up his investigation and prepared for bed. He rolled out his sleeping bag on the air mattress, set his alarm for 6 a.m., and lay in the darkness listening to the warehouse settle around him. The building made sounds at night, creaks and groans, and the occasional bang of metal expanding and contracting with temperature changes. But rather than keeping him awake, the sounds felt comforting, like the building was welcoming him home. For the first time in 2 years, Marcus Riley fell asleep without taking the anxiety medication the VA doctors had prescribed. He slept deeply and dreamlessly, and when his alarm went off at 6, he woke feeling more rested than he had in months. The next week fell into a routine. Marcus would wake early, make coffee on his camping stove, and spend the morning organizing his space and getting familiar with the building's systems. The electrical panel was a marvel of 1950s engineering, dozens of circuits, controlling everything from the main floor lighting to the loading dock hydraulics. Most of the breakers were clearly labeled in Harrison Volk's careful handwriting. East wall lights, office complex, security system, vault power, vault power. Marcus stared at that label for a long time, thinking about the heavy steel door in the storage room, and the industrial shelving, and the metallic smell that still lingered in certain parts of the building. Harrison Volk had been a precious metals dealer with serious security and heavy-duty storage capabilities. The vault room was obviously where he'd kept his most valuable inventory. But if Volk had been dealing in gold and silver and platinum, where was it all when he abandoned the building? Had he sold everything before walking away? Had someone else cleaned out the valuable inventory after he left? Or was there more to the story than Beth had known? Marcus spent his afternoons exploring the neighborhood, getting to know the industrial district that was now his home. Most of the buildings were empty, their owners long since given up on finding tenants willing to lease space in a part of town that had been forgotten by economic development. But there were still some active businesses, a metalworking shop that specialized in custom fabrication, a trucking company that operated out of a building that looked like it had been bombed and rebuilt several times, and a diner that served coffee strong enough to dissolve concrete and breakfast that was cheap enough for people working jobs that paid by the day. It was at the diner that Marcus first heard stories about Harrison Volk. "Strangest damn man I ever met," said Eddie Kowalski, who ran the metalworking shop and was apparently related to Marcus's real estate agent. Had trucks coming and going at all hours, but never talked to nobody. Always paid cash. Always minded his own business. Always looked like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. The diner's owner, a woman named Rose who had probably been running the place since the industrial district was actually industrial, brought Marcus another cup of coffee and joined the conversation. Harrison was all right, she said, defensive of her former customer. Quiet, but polite. Always said please and thank you. Always left a decent tip. Ordered the same thing every day for 15 years. Black coffee and wheat toast. No butter. What happened to him? Marcus asked. I heard he just walked away from his business. Rose and Eddie exchanged a look that suggested they knew more than they were willing to say in front of a stranger. Had some troubles, Rose said finally. Government troubles. You know how it is when the feds start poking around a man's business. Even if you got nothing to hide, it can ruin you. What kind of troubles? Eddie shrugged. IRS, FBI, ATF alphabet soup of federal agents asking questions about his metals business. Never could figure out what they were after. But Harrison, he got spooked. Started talking about how the government was trying to destroy small businessmen. How they were making it impossible for an honest man to make a living. And then one day he just stopped coming in, Rose added. Buildings sat empty, trucks stopped running, phones went dead. 6 months later, we heard he died down in Florida. Heart attack. Marcus finished his coffee and left a tip generous enough to ensure he'd be welcome back, walking home through the empty streets of the industrial district. He thought about Harrison Volk, a man who'd built a successful business over 30 years, only to abandon it when federal investigators came asking questions. But what questions? And what had they been looking for? That evening, Marcus returned to the patch of mismatched concrete in his warehouse floor. He knelt beside it and tapped methodically, listening to the subtle differences in sound. Whatever was beneath this floor, Harrison Volk had gone to considerable trouble to hide it, and if he'd died 6 months after abandoning his business, he'd taken the secret with him. Marcus retrieved a flashlight from his gear and examined the edges of the concrete patch more carefully. Now that he knew what to look for, he could see hairline cracks running along the boundaries. Not random settling cracks, but deliberate seams where new concrete met old. Someone had cut through the original floor, excavated beneath it, and then sealed it back up with a fresh pour. The question was what they'd hidden down there, and whether it was still there. Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, he would rent a jackhammer and find out what Harrison Volk had buried beneath his warehouse floor. He had no idea that he was about to discover the largest hidden fortune in the history of the state, or that his life was about to become far more complicated than a disabled veteran living alone in an empty warehouse. But somewhere in the back of his mind, Marcus Riley felt the same sensation he'd experienced as a soldier on patrol in Afghanistan. The electric awareness that came just before everything changed, the moment when the ordinary world revealed itself to be far more dangerous and far more wonderful than anyone had imagined. Tomorrow he would dig, and nothing would ever be the same. Asterisk, asterisk. Part 2. The Discovery. Asterisk. The hardware store opened at 7 a.m., and Marcus was waiting in the parking lot when the owner, a grizzled man named Pete, who looked like he'd been selling tools since the Eisenhower administration, unlocked the front doors. The autumn air was sharp with the promise of winter, and Marcus's breath came out in small puffs as he walked through the aisles, gathering the equipment he would need: a pneumatic jackhammer, rated for concrete work, safety glasses and a dust mask, extension cords and work lights, a small crowbar for cleanup work. The rental cost would eat into his remaining savings. But Marcus had spent 2 weeks thinking about that patch of concrete, and he couldn't let it go. Something was down there, hidden deliberately by Harrison Volk for reasons Marcus couldn't begin to guess. Breaking up a driveway? Pete asked as he processed the rental paperwork. Something like that, Marcus replied, not wanting to explain that he was about to excavate his own warehouse floor based on nothing more than intuition and the sound concrete made when he tapped it with his knuckles. By 8:30, Marcus was back at the warehouse, unloading equipment from his truck. The building felt different in the morning light, more substantial, more permanent. Yesterday, it had been his shelter. Today, it was about to become the site of his first real decision as a property owner. To dig or not to dig, to investigate or to let sleeping secrets lie. Marcus set up work lights around the patch of suspicious concrete and plugged in the jackhammer. The machine was heavier than he'd expected, and it took some adjustment to balance it properly with his prosthetic leg. But once he found his stance, muscle memory from his military engineering training took over. He'd operated much heavier equipment in Afghanistan, breaking up roads and clearing obstacles under conditions far more challenging than a quiet warehouse in Ohio. The first strike of the jackhammer sent vibrations through the concrete and up through his arms. The bit penetrated about an inch, creating a small crater surrounded by hairline cracks. Dust rose from the impact point, and the sound echoed through the empty warehouse like gunfire. Marcus worked methodically, starting at one corner of the discolored patch and creating a line of holes about 6 inches apart. The concrete was thick, at least 4 inches, possibly more, and reinforced with rebar that sparked when the jackhammer bit struck it. After an hour of work, he'd created a rough outline about 3 feet by 3 feet, enough to see what lay beneath, without destroying the entire patch. The breakthrough came suddenly. Marcus was working on a particularly stubborn section when the jackhammer bit punched through the concrete entirely, disappearing into empty space beneath the floor. He shut off the machine and knelt beside the hole, shining his flashlight into the opening. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. Gleaming metal, smooth, polished surfaces that reflected his flashlight beam like mirrors. And not just 1 or 2 pieces, rows upon rows of identical objects, stretching away into darkness beyond the reach of his light. Marcus widened the hole, using the crowbar to pry away chunks of broken concrete. As the opening grew, more of the hidden space became visible. It wasn't just a cavity, it was a vault, deliberately excavated and lined with concrete walls. And it was filled with what could only be precious metals. The first object he pulled out was heavy enough that he nearly dropped it. A bar of silver, roughly the size and shape of a brick, but so dense that it felt like it was made of lead. Stamped into one end were the numbers 999 and a maker's mark he didn't recognize. Pure silver, 32 ounces, according to the weight stamped on the side. Marcus set the bar on the warehouse floor and reached for another. Then another. Each one identical pure silver, precisely machined, meticulously stored. By the time he'd extracted a dozen bars, his arms ached from the weight, and his mind was reeling from the implications. He sat back on his heels and stared at the growing pile of silver bars. At current market prices, each bar was worth somewhere around $800. A dozen bars represented nearly $10,000 more than he'd paid for the entire warehouse. But this was clearly just the beginning. Marcus shone his flashlight into the vault again, trying to estimate the scope of what Harrison Volk had hidden. The space was larger than he'd initially thought, roughly 10 feet by 15 feet, extending beneath the warehouse floor like a buried treasure room. And every surface was lined with metal shelving units, each one filled with silver bars, stacked like cordwood. He climbed down into the vault, his prosthetic leg making the descent awkward but manageable. The air was cool and dry, suggesting that Volk had taken care to protect his hoard from moisture and corrosion. The silver bars were organized by type and size: commercial ingots on one wall, smaller artistic pieces on another, and in the far corner, wooden crates that were too heavy for Marcus to lift. Using his crowbar, Marcus pried open one of the crates. Inside, nestled in wood shavings like eggs, were silver coins, American eagles, Canadian maple leafs, and older pieces he didn't recognize. Hundreds of them, possibly thousands, each one gleaming as if it had been minted yesterday. Another crate contained what looked like antique silverware tea sets, candlesticks, serving trays, all tarnished with age but clearly valuable. Some pieces bore hallmarks that Marcus recognized as belonging to famous silversmiths. These weren't just precious metals, they were works of art, historical artifacts worth far more than their weight in silver. But it was the back wall of the vault that made Marcus sit down hard on a wooden crate, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd discovered. Commercial silver bars, each weighing 1,000 ounces, more than 60 pounds of pure metal. They were stacked 10 high and 20 deep, creating a wall of silver that seemed to glow in the flashlight beam. Marcus counted the stacks twice, then a third time, not believing the numbers his mind was calculating. 200 bars, 200,000 ounces of silver. At current market prices of approximately $23 per ounce, each bar was worth $23,000. The wall alone represented $4,600,000 in precious metal. And that was just one wall of the vault. Marcus spent the next 4 hours cataloging what he could see, taking photographs with his phone, making notes in a composition book he'd found in his truck. His estimates were conservative, but even the low-end numbers were staggering. Silver bars of various sizes, approximately 8,000 ounces. Commercial 1,000-ounce bars, 200 units, 200,000 ounces total. Silver coins, at least 10,000 pieces, possibly more. Antique silverware and collectibles, impossible to estimate without expert appraisal. Total estimated weight, over 200,000 ounces of silver. Estimated value at current market prices, between $180 and $230 million. $230 million. Marcus climbed out of the vault and sat on the warehouse floor, his back against a support column, staring at the hole he'd created and the treasure it had revealed. The number was so large it didn't feel real. He'd never made more than $40,000 in a year, even as a staff sergeant with combat pay. His disability checks were less than $2,000 a month. The $8,500 he'd paid for the warehouse had been his entire life savings. And now, he was looking at enough wealth to make him one of the richest people in the state. But along with the excitement came a flood of questions that made his head spin. Who had Harrison Volk been? Really? How had he accumulated so much silver without anyone knowing? Why had he hidden it beneath his warehouse floor? And most importantly, why had he abandoned it? Marcus pulled out his phone and spent the next hour researching silver prices, precious metals dealers, and the legal implications of finding treasure on property you own. The news was encouraging. In most states, anything found on your property belongs to you, unless it can be proven to be stolen goods or someone else can provide legitimate ownership documents. But a fortune this large would inevitably attract attention. The IRS would want their share. State and local governments might claim taxes or fees. And if the silver had been acquired illegally, federal authorities could seize it as evidence. Marcus thought about Harrison Volk, the reclusive metals dealer who'd walked away from his business when federal investigators started asking questions. Had he been hiding something illegal? Or had he simply been a careful businessman who'd accumulated wealth slowly and steadily over 3 decades? There was only one way to find out. Marcus needed to learn everything he could about Harrison Volk's business, his methods, his sources. He needed documentation that would prove the silver was legitimately acquired. And he needed to understand why Volk had abandoned it all, rather than fight for what was his. As afternoon turned to evening, Marcus carefully replaced the silver bars he'd removed from the vault. He covered the opening with a sheet of plywood and secured it with padlocks, then spent another hour cleaning up the concrete dust and debris from his excavation. To a casual observer, the warehouse floor looked unchanged, just another patch of concrete among many. But beneath that innocent-looking surface lay a treasure that could change everything. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay on his air mattress, listening to the warehouse settle around him, and thought about the silver bars gleaming in the darkness beneath his feet. For 2 years, he'd felt like a man without purpose, a broken soldier drifting through a civilian world that didn't seem to have a place for him. Now, suddenly, he had options, choices, power. The question was, what was he going to do with it? Marcus spent the next week in research mode, diving deep into Harrison Volk's background and business history. The public records painted a picture of a methodical, successful businessman who'd operated Volk Metals and Recovery for 32 years without major incident. The business had been licensed by the state to purchase precious metals from individuals and other dealers. Volk had maintained the proper insurance, filed the required reports, and paid his taxes on time. He'd been a member of several professional organizations for metals dealers, and had maintained good relationships with banks, security companies, and shipping firms. But the deeper Marcus dug, the more questions arose. Volk's business had grown dramatically in the final years before he abandoned it, purchasing massive quantities of silver at a time when most dealers were seeing decreased volume. The invoices Marcus found in the warehouse office showed transactions worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes multiple times per month. Where had Volk found so many sellers? How had he financed such large purchases? And why had he chosen to store everything in a hidden vault rather than in conventional commercial storage? The answers began to emerge when Marcus found a box of correspondence hidden in the back of a filing cabinet. Letters from private individuals, families dealing with estates, collectors looking to liquidate holdings. What emerged was a picture of Harrison Volk as more than just a metals dealer. He was a trusted intermediary for people who needed to sell silver quickly and discreetly. Many of the letters told similar stories. An elderly person needing cash for medical bills, a family settling an estate that included a large silver collection, investors looking to diversify out of precious metals and into other assets. Volk had built a reputation as someone who paid fair prices, asked no unnecessary questions, and could handle transactions of any size. But it was a letter dated just 6 months before Volk abandoned his business that made Marcus's blood run cold. Dear Harrison, I've been hearing disturbing rumors about federal investigations into precious metals dealers in our region. The word is that some agents believe large-scale silver accumulation is being used to launder money for organized crime. I know you've always been careful about documentation, but these days, that might not be enough. Consider liquidating some of your holdings while the market is strong and before any investigations expand to include our area. The federal government is casting a wide net, and even innocent dealers are getting caught up in their dragnet. Best regards, William Hartley. Hartley Precious Metals, Federal Investigations, Money Laundering, Organized Crime. Marcus read the letter 3 times, trying to understand its implications. Had Volk been involved in something illegal? Or had he simply been a legitimate businessman who got caught up in a broader investigation targeting the precious metals industry? The next piece of the puzzle came from a local newspaper article Marcus found in the online archives. Local businessman questioned in federal investigation. Harrison Volk, 62, owner of Volk Metals and Recovery, was questioned by federal agents this week as part of an ongoing investigation into precious metals dealers suspected of facilitating money laundering for organized crime. Volk was not arrested and has not been charged with any wrongdoing. Through his attorney, he denied any criminal activity and stated his full intention to cooperate with federal authorities. The investigation is part of a multi-state effort to identify businesses that may be unknowingly or deliberately helping criminal organizations convert cash into precious metals, which can then be sold to legitimate dealers with no questions asked. According to sources familiar with the investigation, federal agents are focusing on dealers who have shown unusual growth in their silver purchases, particularly those who deal primarily in cash transactions. Volk's business has operated in the Hartwell Industrial Complex for nearly 30 years and has been known for purchasing silver from estate sales, private collectors, and other legitimate sources. Neighbors described Volk as a quiet, hard-working businessman who kept to himself and maintained a professional operation. Federal agents declined to comment on the specific allegations or the scope of their investigation. The article was dated February 14, 2014. According to the property records, Volk had abandoned his warehouse in September of 2015, 19 months later, enough time for a federal investigation to destroy a man's life. Even if he was completely innocent, Marcus could picture it. Months of surveillance, agents showing up at Volk's business, asking questions, customers getting nervous and taking their business elsewhere, banks becoming reluctant to process transactions for someone under federal investigation. Even if Volk had done nothing wrong, the investigation itself would have been enough to kill his business. And so he'd walked away from it all. 30 years of work, millions of dollars in inventory, a lifetime of careful accumulation. He'd sealed his fortune in a concrete vault and disappeared, hoping that someday the heat would die down and he could return. But he died 6 months later, taking the location of his treasure with him, until Marcus had bought the warehouse for $8,500 and decided to investigate a patch of concrete that sounded different when he tapped it. Now Marcus faced the same dilemma that had driven Harrison Volk into hiding. How do you prove that a massive fortune in precious metals was acquired legitimately? How do you convince federal authorities that you're not laundering money when the very size of your holdings suggests criminal activity? Marcus spent that night walking the perimeter of his warehouse, thinking through his options. He could simply sell the silver quietly, a few bars at a time, flying under the radar of federal investigators. But that would take years and would leave him vulnerable to accusations that he was trying to hide something. Or he could go public, document everything, pay his taxes, and hope that Harrison Volk's business records would be enough to establish the legitimacy of the hoard. But that would inevitably attract attention from the IRS, from federal investigators who might still be interested in Volk's business, and from criminals who might decide that a disabled veteran living alone in a warehouse was an easy target. As dawn approached, Marcus made his decision. He would approach the situation the way he'd been trained to approach dangerous missions in Afghanistan. Carefully, methodically, with good intelligence and proper backup. He would hire a lawyer who specialized in federal investigations and precious metals law. He would research Harrison Volk's business records until he could account for every ounce of silver in the vault. He would document everything, pay every tax owed, and establish beyond any doubt that he was the legitimate owner of the treasure he'd discovered. And if federal investigators came knocking, he would be ready for them. What Marcus didn't know was that his discovery was about to attract attention from people far more dangerous than IRS agents or FBI investigators. The silver in his vault had a history that went back decades, and there were people who had been searching for it ever since Harrison Volk disappeared. People who would not be satisfied with lawyers and documentation and legitimate ownership claims. People who preferred to settle disputes with methods that had nothing to do with the legal system. The real estate agent, a woman named Beth who wore too much perfume and kept checking her phone, fumbled with the padlock. "I have to be honest with you," she said, not looking at him. "This place has been on the market for 18 months. The last owner just walked away from it. Couldn't make the taxes." Marcus nodded, watching a crow pick at something in the gravel. He didn't need honest. He needed cheap. The disability checks covered his rent in the studio apartment across town, but barely. The settlement from the army had been modest enough for the warehouse, and maybe 6 months of basic survival if he was careful. Previous owner was some kind of metals dealer, Beth continued, finally getting the lock open. Had the place from 1983 to about 5 years ago, kept to himself mostly. Folks around here called him the Silver Ghost, because he never talked to nobody, and his hair went white early. The heavy steel door groaned open, and stale air rushed out. Marcus stepped inside, and for a moment, the silence felt sacred. Shafts of pale light fell through dirty skylights, illuminating a vast open space. Concrete floors stretched in every direction, interrupted by steel support columns. The walls were lined with empty metal shelving units, and a small office sat elevated in one corner, its windows dark and cracked. 23,000 square feet, Beth said, her voice echoing. Loading dock in the back, 3-phase electrical, though I can't promise it all works. Heating systems probably shot. Marcus walked deeper into the space, his boots echoing with each step. The prosthetic made a subtle clicking sound against the concrete, a rhythm he'd grown used to. There was something about the emptiness that appealed to him. No crowds, no noise, no people asking how he was doing with that look in their eyes, the one that said they knew he wasn't. What was he dealing in exactly? Marcus asked. The previous owner? Beth shrugged. Scrap metal, I think. Maybe some coins or something. He had trucks coming and going, but nobody really paid attention. This part of town, people mind their own business. Marcus stopped in the center of the warehouse and looked up at the skylights. A bird had built a nest in one of the broken panes, and he could hear faint chirping. The place felt forgotten, abandoned, overlooked, just like he did most days. I'll take it, he said quietly. Beth blinked. Don't you want to see the rest? Check the electrical. Have an inspection. No, Marcus said, pulling out his checkbook. I'll take it as is. That night, Marcus sat in his studio apartment, on a mattress on the floor, staring at the deed. The paper felt heavier than it should have, like it was made of something more substantial than legal jargon and notary stamps. Outside, the city hummed with traffic and sirens, but all he could think about was the silence of the warehouse. His phone buzzed. A text from his sister Kelly in Seattle. Called your landlord. You didn't renew your lease? Where are you going to live? He typed back. Figured something out. Don't worry. Dues are. Don't worry. But she would worry. Kelly had been worrying about him since the day he came home from Walter Reed with his new leg and old nightmares. She'd offered to let him move to Seattle, get him set up with VA counselors and support groups, and all the things that were supposed to help, but somehow made him feel more broken than before. Marcus set the phone aside and looked around the apartment. Everything he owned fit in 3 duffel bags and a plastic storage bin. Clothes, a few books, his army medals in a box he never opened, and a picture of his squad from his second deployment. Half the guys in the photo were dead now. The other half were scattered across the country, trying to figure out what came after the uniform. The next morning, he loaded his truck, a beat-up Ford Ranger he'd bought with cash, and drove across town to the warehouse. The November sun was weak and pale, casting long shadows across the industrial district. Most of the businesses here had closed years ago when the steel plant shut down, leaving behind a graveyard of empty buildings and broken dreams. Marcus parked by the loading dock and unlocked the door. The warehouse felt different when it was his, not just empty, but full of possibility. He'd never owned anything before, not really. The army had given him everything: a place to sleep, food to eat, a purpose that got him up every morning. But this was his. He walked to the far end of the building, where a smaller room connected to the main floor. It had probably been used for storage or maybe an office. The walls were concrete block, painted an institutional green that had faded to the color of old moss. There was one window, grimy but unbroken, and a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. This would be home. Marcus spent the first week making the space livable. He installed a small propane heater he'd bought at a flea market and hung tarps to divide the room into sections: sleeping area, small kitchen, place to sit. It wasn't much, but it was quiet, and quiet was what he needed. During the days, he explored the warehouse. The main floor was mostly empty, but the previous owner had left behind some equipment: a small forklift that wouldn't start, several steel work tables, and dozens of metal storage containers of various sizes. Most were empty, but a few contained what looked like industrial supplies: chains, cables, thick rubber mats. It was on the 8th day that Marcus noticed something odd. He'd been walking the perimeter of the main floor, checking for leaks or structural problems, when he stepped on a section that sounded different. Instead of the solid thunk of his boot on concrete, there was a hollow echo, subtle but distinct. Marcus knelt and tapped the floor with his knuckles. Solid. He moved a few inches and tapped again. Still solid. But when he returned to the spot where he'd been standing, there it was a different sound, like there was a void beneath the concrete. He spent an hour mapping the area, tapping and listening. The hollow section was roughly 10 feet by 10 feet, hidden beneath what looked like the same concrete as the rest of the floor. But the color was slightly off, and when he looked closely, he could see hairline cracks forming a rough square. That night, Marcus lay on his air mattress staring up at the ceiling. The warehouse was full of sounds at night: settling metal, wind through broken windows, the scurry of mice in the walls. But his mind kept returning to that hollow section of floor. The next morning, he drove to a tool rental place and came back with a small jackhammer. He'd told the clerk he was breaking up concrete for a drain, which wasn't entirely a lie. He needed to know what was under there. Marcus had operated heavier equipment in the army, so the jackhammer felt almost delicate in his hands. He started at one corner of the hollow section, where the cracks were most pronounced. The concrete was thicker than he'd expected, almost 6 inches, and reinforced with rebar. After 2 hours of work, he'd opened a hole about the size of a dinner plate. He shone his flashlight into the opening and saw something that made his heart skip. Metal. Smooth, gleaming metal that reflected his flashlight beam like a mirror. Marcus widened the hole, breaking away chunks of concrete until he could reach inside. His fingers touched something cold and incredibly heavy. He managed to grip it and pull, and what emerged was a bar of silver pure, polished silver, about the size of a loaf of bread, and so heavy he almost dropped it. His hands shook as he turned it over. Stamped into one end was a mark he didn't recognize, and the numbers 99.9, pure silver. He set it on the concrete beside the hole and reached in again. Another bar. Then another. And another. By the time the sun was setting, Marcus had pulled 17 silver bars from what was clearly a much larger collection. Each bar weighed about 32 ounces, 2 pounds of pure silver. He'd done the math in his head. At current silver prices, each bar was worth around $800. But as he knelt beside the growing pile, one thing became crystal clear. This was just the beginning. The hole he'd opened revealed the edge of what looked like a much larger cache. The silver bars were stacked like bricks, row upon row, disappearing into darkness beyond the reach of his flashlight. The hollow sound hadn't been from an empty void, it had been from a vault, sealed and forgotten, filled with enough precious metal to change everything. Marcus sat back against a support column, his prosthetic legs stretched out in front of him, and stared at the silver bars gleaming in the fading light. His mind raced with questions. Who had hidden this? Why? How much was there? And most importantly, was it legal for him to keep it? The previous owner, the Silver Ghost as the neighbors had called him, had been a metals dealer. Had this been his inventory, his life savings, or had he been storing it for someone else? Marcus picked up one of the bars again, feeling its weight, its substance. 2 years ago, he'd been a soldier with a clear mission and unshakable purpose. Then an IED had taken his leg and left him adrift in a world that didn't seem to have a place for him. He'd bought this warehouse with his last dollars, not knowing what came next. Now, sitting surrounded by enough silver to change his life forever, Marcus Riley realized that sometimes the greatest discoveries happen when you're not looking for them at all. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay on his air mattress, listening to the warehouse settle around him, and thought about the 17 silver bars he'd locked in a storage container across the room. Tomorrow, he would rent a bigger jackhammer and see exactly what the Silver Ghost had left behind. But tonight, he allowed himself to imagine, for the first time in 2 years, that maybe his story wasn't over after all. The morning came gray and cold, with frost covering the warehouse windows like lace. Marcus woke before sunrise, as he always did. But this time it wasn't nightmares that pulled him from sleep, it was anticipation. The silver bars were real. He'd checked them 3 times before going to bed, weighing them in his hands, studying the maker's marks, even tasting the metal the way his grandfather had taught him to test coins when he was a boy. Marcus made instant coffee on his camping stove and ate a breakfast of crackers and peanut butter while staring at the hole in the floor. In the pale morning light, he could see deeper into the void. The silver bars extended further than he'd realized, stacked in neat rows that disappeared into shadows. He spent the morning at the library, using their computer to research silver prices, vault storage, and the legal implications of finding precious metals on property you own. The news was encouraging. In most states, anything found on your property belongs to you, unless it can be proven to be stolen goods or someone else can provide legitimate ownership documents. Marcus also researched the previous owner of the warehouse. Harrison Volk had been 67 when he abandoned the property. According to public records, he'd operated Volk Metals and Recovery from 1983 until 2015. The business had been registered as a scrap metal dealer and precious metals buyer, licensed by the state to purchase gold, silver, platinum, and other valuable metals from individuals and businesses. Volk had died 6 months after walking away from the warehouse. No family, no will, no claims on his assets. The property had reverted to the county for unpaid taxes, eventually ending up at the auction where Marcus had bought it. Armed with this information, Marcus returned to the warehouse with renewed purpose and a rented pneumatic breaker. The bigger tool made quick work of the concrete. And by noon, he had opened a section large enough to climb down into. What he found defied belief. The vault was roughly 20 feet by 30 feet, carved out of the earth and lined with concrete walls. Steel shelving units ran along the perimeter, and every inch was filled with silver bars. Not dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands. Marcus climbed down into the space, his flashlight beam sweeping across rows upon rows of gleaming metal. The bars were organized by size and type. Standard 1,000-ounce commercial bars, smaller 100-ounce bars, and even some artistic pieces that looked like they might be collectible. In one corner, he found wooden crates stacked to the ceiling. He pried one open and discovered it filled with silver coins, American eagles, Canadian maple leafs, and older pieces he didn't recognize. Another crate contained what looked like antique silverware, tea sets, candlesticks, serving platters, all tarnished with age but clearly valuable. But it was the back wall that made him sit down hard on a wooden crate, overwhelmed by the scope of what he'd uncovered. An entire wall of the vault was dedicated to commercial silver bars, each weighing 1,000 ounces. They were stacked 10 high and 20 deep, creating a wall of precious metal that seemed to glow in the flashlight beam. Marcus counted the stacks twice, then a third time, not believing the numbers. 200 bars, 200,000 ounces of silver. His hands shook as he did the calculations. At $23 per ounce, the current market price, each bar was worth $23,000. The wall alone represented $4,600,000 in silver. And that was just one wall. Marcus spent the next 3 hours cataloging what he could see, making lists, taking measurements. By his rough estimates, the vault contained somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 ounces of silver in various forms. At current prices, he was looking at a treasure worth between $180 and $230 million. $230 million. The number was so large it didn't feel real. Marcus had never made more than $35,000 in a year, even as a staff sergeant in the army. His disability payments were $1,800 a month. The $8,500 he'd paid for the warehouse had been his entire life savings, and now he was standing in a vault that contained enough wealth to make him one of the richest people in the state. Marcus climbed out of the vault and sat on the warehouse floor, his back against a support column. The magnitude of the discovery was overwhelming, not just financially but emotionally. For 2 years, he'd felt like the world had forgotten him, like his best days were behind him. He'd bought the warehouse not as an investment, but as a place to disappear, to hide from a world that didn't seem to have room for broken soldiers. But Harrison Volk had chosen this place for a different reason. He'd spent 32 years carefully, methodically accumulating silver and hiding it away like a dragon hoarding treasure. And now that treasure belonged to Marcus. The question was, what was he going to do with it? As the afternoon wore on, Marcus found himself drawn back to the vault again and again. Each time he climbed down, he discovered something new. A collection of silver mining certificates from the 1900s, a leather journal filled with entries about precious metals purchases, and in one corner, a small steel box containing what looked like correspondence with dealers around the country. The letters painted a picture of Harrison Volk as a methodical, patient man who'd spent decades building relationships with silver miners, dealers, and collectors. He'd bought consistently, paying cash, storing everything in the vault he'd built beneath his warehouse. According to the dates on the letters, he'd been adding to the collection right up until 2015, when he'd simply walked away. In the last letter, dated just 3 months before Volk abandoned the property, Marcus found something that sent chills down his spine. Dear Harrison, I've been hearing rumors about federal investigations into precious metals dealers. I know you've always been careful about paperwork, but these days that might not be enough. Consider liquidating some of your position while the market is strong. The wolves are circling, and they're hungrier than they used to be. Best regards, William. Federal investigations. Marcus read the letter 3 times, trying to understand its implications. Had Volk been involved in something illegal? Was the silver stolen? Was that why he'd abandoned it? Marcus climbed out of the vault and sealed it back up with a sheet of plywood and several padlocks. Whatever Harrison Volk had been afraid of, whatever had made him walk away from a fortune in silver, Marcus needed to understand it before word of his discovery got out. That night, he called his sister Kelly for the first time in 2 months. Marcus. Oh my God, I was starting to worry. Are you okay? Where are you? Marcus. Where are you? Her voice was warm, concerned. Exactly what he needed to hear. I'm fine, Kel. Better than fine, actually. I bought a place. A warehouse. A warehouse? Marcus. What are you going to do with a warehouse? He looked around his makeshift living space. Then at the padlocked section of floor that hid enough wealth to change both their lives forever. I'm not sure yet, he said. But I think everything's about to change. The next week passed in a blur of research, planning, and sleepless nights. Marcus hired a lawyer, a woman named Patricia Hoffman, who specialized in property law and had experience with mineral rights and found assets. He told her he'd discovered some silver on his property and needed to understand his legal rights. Patricia was thorough, professional, and reassuring. After reviewing his property deed and researching Harrison Volk's business history, she confirmed what Marcus had hoped. The silver was legally his. Volk's business had been legitimate, and there were no outstanding claims on the property or its contents. The previous owner died intestate with no heirs, Patricia explained during their second meeting. The property was sold for taxes. Whatever you found belongs to you, subject to federal taxes on the value of the find. Of course. Taxes. Marcus hadn't thought about taxes. Patricia explained that found treasure was considered income by the IRS, taxable at fair market value in the year it was discovered. On $200 million, the federal tax alone would be somewhere around $70 million. But even after taxes, he'd still be wealthy beyond imagination. Marcus authorized Patricia to begin the process of legally documenting the find and researching the proper procedures for declaring it to the IRS. It would take time, months, maybe a year, but it needed to be done right. In the meantime, he continued living in the warehouse, guarding his secret, planning his future. It was on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after his initial discovery, that Marcus heard a car pull up outside. He was in the vault, carefully cataloging a section of antique silverware, when the sound of footsteps on gravel made him freeze. Marcus climbed out quickly, replaced the plywood cover, and went to the window. A black sedan was parked by the loading dock, and 2 men in suits were walking toward the entrance. They didn't look like salesmen or city inspectors. They looked like federal agents. The knocking on the door was firm, authoritative. Marcus took a deep breath, checked that the vault was properly concealed, and went to answer. Marcus Riley? The first man was tall, thin, with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. "I'm Agent Collins, FBI. This is Agent Martinez. We'd like to ask you a few questions about Harrison Volk." Marcus's blood turned cold, but his military training kicked in. "Stay calm. Answer only what's asked. Volunteer nothing." "I bought this place at a tax auction," he said. "Never met the previous owner." "Ever done?" Agent Collins smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. We're just tying up some loose ends on an old investigation. May we come in?" What happens next will turn this discovery upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest fortunes carry the most dangerous secrets. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Marcus stepped back and gestured for the agents to enter. They walked into the warehouse slowly, their eyes scanning every corner, every surface. Agent Martinez stopped near the concealed vault, his gaze lingering on the plywood covering. "Doing some renovations?" he asked, casually. "Fixing a drain issue," Marcus replied, keeping his voice steady. "Previous owner left some problems behind." Agent Collins pulled out a small notebook. "What do you know about Harrison Volk's business operations, Mr. Riley?" "Nothing beyond what's in the public records. He was a metals dealer, had the business for 30-something years." Marcus shifted his weight, conscious of his prosthetic leg clicking against the concrete. "Did you find anything unusual when you moved in?" "Equipment, inventory, paperwork." Marcus felt the weight of the question. These agents weren't here by coincidence. They were looking for something specific, possibly the very thing he'd found. "Some old tables and storage containers," he said. "Nothing valuable." The agents exchanged a glance. Agent Martinez walked closer to the vault area and knelt, running his hand along the edge of the plywood. "Mind if we take a look at this drain problem you mentioned?" Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs. "Actually, I'd prefer if you didn't. It's not safe exposed pipes. Chemical cleaners. I've got a contractor coming next week." Agent Collins closed his notebook and looked directly at Marcus. "Mr. Riley, we have reason to believe Harrison Volk was involved in money laundering through his metals business. If you've found anything that might be connected to those activities, it would be in your best interest to cooperate with our investigation." Money laundering. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. If the silver was connected to criminal activity, he could lose everything, not just the treasure, but his freedom. "I told you," he said, struggling to keep his voice level. "I haven't found anything like that." Agent Martinez stood up and brushed dust off his hands. "Fair enough. But if something does turn up, you'll want to call us immediately." He handed Marcus a business card. "We'd hate for you to accidentally obstruct a federal investigation." The threat was clear, polite but unmistakable. After the agents left, Marcus sat alone in the warehouse, their business card turning over and over in his hands. Everything had changed in the span of 15 minutes. The silver wasn't just a treasure anymore. It was evidence in a federal investigation. That night, Marcus called Patricia Hoffman. "They were fishing," she said after he described the visit. "If they had a warrant or probable cause, they would have searched the property. The fact that they left suggests they don't have solid evidence. But if the silver is connected to money laundering, then we need to be very careful about how we proceed." Patricia interrupted. "I'm going to contact a colleague who specializes in federal criminal defense. We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with before we make any moves." Marcus lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the warehouse settle around him. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a broken veteran with no prospects and no future. Now he was sitting on a fortune that could either save his life or destroy it. The next few days passed in a haze of anxiety and preparation. Marcus continued his research, diving deeper into Harrison Volk's background and business dealings. What he found was troubling. Volk's business had grown dramatically in the years before he abandoned it, purchasing massive quantities of silver at a time when most dealers were seeing their volume decrease. There were also gaps in the public records, periods where Volk's business filings were late or incomplete, suggesting he might have been trying to hide something. But the most disturbing discovery came when Marcus found a local news article from 2014, buried in the online archives of the county newspaper. Local businessman questioned in federal investigation. Harrison Volk, owner of Volk Metals and Recovery, was questioned by federal agents this week as part of an ongoing investigation into precious metals dealers suspected of laundering money for organized crime. Volk was not arrested and has not been charged with any crimes. Through his attorney, he denied any wrongdoing and stated his full intention to cooperate with authorities. The investigation is part of a multi-state effort to crack down on businesses that may be facilitating money laundering through the purchase and sale of precious metals. Marcus read the article 3 times, his stomach sinking further with each pass. The timeline matched perfectly. Volk was questioned in 2014, continued operating for another year while presumably under surveillance, then suddenly abandoned his business and property in 2015. He hadn't just walked away from his treasure, he'd fled from it. The silver in the vault might not just be valuable. It might be the proceeds of criminal activity, hidden away by a man who knew he was about to be arrested. And now Marcus was the legal owner of what could be the largest collection of laundered money in the form of precious metals in federal law enforcement history. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just rich, he was in possession of evidence in a federal crime. The agents who had visited weren't going away. They would be back, probably with warrants and search teams and questions he couldn't answer, without admitting he'd found the very thing they were looking for. Marcus sat in the vault that evening, surrounded by millions of dollars in silver, and realized that Harrison Volk's treasure might not be a blessing, it might be a curse that would destroy everything he'd hoped to build. But as he sat there, something else occurred to him. Volk had lived with this secret for years, had accumulated this wealth systematically and carefully. Whatever criminal connections the silver might have, Volk himself had been a careful, methodical businessman. The letters Marcus had found showed a man who kept detailed records, maintained professional relationships, and operated his business with precision. Maybe the FBI was wrong. Maybe Volk hadn't been laundering money, maybe he'd just been a successful metals dealer who'd gotten caught up in a broader investigation. Maybe the silver was legitimate after all. There was only one way to find out. Marcus needed to learn everything he could about Harrison Volk's business, his methods, his sources. If the silver was clean, he needed to prove it. If it wasn't, he needed to decide whether to turn it over to the authorities or find another solution. Either way, his discovery had just become far more complicated than a simple treasure hunt. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Marcus was cataloging another section of the vault when he heard a knock at the door. He climbed out, concealed the entrance, and went to investigate. An elderly woman stood outside, bent slightly with age but with eyes that sparkled with intelligence. She wore a wool coat despite the mild weather, and carried a leather handbag that looked older than Marcus. "You must be the young man who bought Harrison's place," she said with a slight smile. I'm Eleanor Volk. Harrison was my brother. Marcus felt the world tilt slightly. Harrison Volk's sister, someone who might have answers to all his questions, standing right at his door, but also someone who might have a legal claim to the silver. I didn't know Mr. Volk had any family, Marcus said carefully. Eleanor chuckled. We weren't close. Harrison was 15 years older than me, and he had his own way of doing things. But I knew about his business, about what he was building here. She looked past Marcus into the warehouse. May I come in? I have some things you might be interested in seeing. Against his better judgment, Marcus stepped aside and let her enter. Eleanor walked slowly through the warehouse, her eyes taking in every detail. When she reached the area above the vault, she stopped and smiled. He did good work, she said softly. Very thorough. Marcus's blood chilled. I'm sorry. I don't understand. Eleanor opened her handbag and pulled out a thick manila folder. Harrison knew the FBI was watching him. He also knew they were wrong about what he was doing. But he couldn't prove it while they were breathing down his neck. She handed Marcus the folder. So, he asked me to hold on to some documents, just in case. Marcus opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were business records, purchase receipts, correspondence, and a letter written in Harrison Volk's careful handwriting. To whoever finds my life's work. The silver you have discovered represents 32 years of honest labor. Every ounce was purchased legitimately. Every transaction was recorded. Every piece was acquired through legal channels. I was forced to abandon it not because I was guilty, but because proving innocence in a federal investigation can bankrupt a man faster than any crime. The FBI believed I was laundering money for organized crime because my business grew during a period when most metals dealers struggled. What they didn't understand is that I had developed relationships with private sellers, families selling inherited silver, estates liquidating collections, individuals who needed cash quickly. I paid fair prices and provided a service. I was never arrested because they never found evidence of wrongdoing. I left because I couldn't afford to keep fighting an investigation that was destroying my life. If you are reading this, then you legally own what I had to abandon. Use it wisely. The world needs more honest people willing to work hard for what they earn. All documentation proving the legitimacy of the collection is in the files my sister maintains. The silver is clean. The records are complete. The fortune is yours by right. Harrison Volk. December 2015. Marcus read the letter twice, then looked up at Eleanor, who was watching him with knowing eyes. He was a good man, she said quietly. Stubborn, secretive, but honest to his core. The FBI wasted 3 years investigating him and never found a shred of evidence, because there wasn't any. Why didn't he fight it? Why did he just leave? Eleanor sighed. Have you ever tried to prove a negative to the federal government? It's impossible and expensive. Harrison spent $40,000 on lawyers and still couldn't get them to close the investigation. So he walked away and started over somewhere else. Started over where? Florida. He opened a small coin shop in Tampa, ran it until he died. Never made much money again, but he was happy. Said he'd done what he set out to do here. Marcus looked around the warehouse, understanding dawning. The vault wasn't just storage. It was his legacy. Eleanor nodded. 32 years of building something permanent. He always said if something happened to him, he hoped whoever found it would understand what it represented, not just wealth, but a lifetime of honest work. That evening, Marcus called Patricia Hoffman, and shared everything Eleanor had told him. They arranged to meet the next day to go through Harrison's documentation and plan their next steps. "If the records are as complete as his sister claims," Patricia said, "then you're in a much stronger position than we thought. The key is being proactive, documenting everything, filing the proper paperwork, and making sure the IRS gets their taxes. What about the FBI agents? If the silver is legitimate, they can investigate all they want. You have nothing to hide." But Marcus wasn't entirely convinced. Federal investigations had their own momentum, and innocent people sometimes got caught up in them through no fault of their own. Harrison Volk's story was proof of that. Still, for the first time since the agent's visit, Marcus felt hopeful. He wasn't just the owner of $200 million in silver. He was the inheritor of one man's lifetime of honest work, hidden away, not out of guilt, but out of necessity. Now the question became, what was he going to do with Harrison Volk's legacy? As winter deepened around the warehouse, Marcus began to develop a plan that went far beyond simply cashing in his discovery. The silver represented more than wealth. It was opportunity, responsibility, and the chance to build something meaningful. He'd been a soldier who'd lost his way after losing his leg. He'd bought a warehouse as a place to disappear. Instead, he'd found a treasure that could transform not just his life, but the lives of others, like him, veterans, struggling to find their place in a world that didn't always understand what they'd sacrificed. Harrison Volk had spent 32 years building a fortune through patience, hard work, and honest dealing. Now it was Marcus's turn to decide what that fortune could become. Asterisk. Part 4. The Resolution. Asterisk. The call to Agent Collins came at exactly 9 a.m. on a Monday morning in early May, 3 weeks after the attempted break-in, and 6 months after Marcus had first broken through the concrete floor of his warehouse. Patricia Hoffman sat beside him at the oak desk he'd moved into the main warehouse space, her legal pad covered with notes and talking points they'd rehearsed for hours. "Agent Collins, this is Marcus Riley. We met at my warehouse in March. I have something important to discuss with you." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then the sound of a man who'd been expecting this call for months. "Mr. Riley." "I'm listening." Marcus took a deep breath and committed himself to a course of action that would change everything. "I found Harrison Volk's silver. All of it. Hidden in a vault beneath my warehouse floor." The silence that followed lasted nearly 30 seconds. When Agent Collins finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "How much silver are we talking about, Mr. Riley?" "Conservative estimate. $230 million worth." Another pause. "Then, I'll be there in 2 hours. Don't touch anything. Don't move anything. And don't discuss this with anyone else until I arrive." Agent Collins arrived with a convoy that looked like a small military operation. FBI agents, Treasury Department investigators, IRS representatives, and what appeared to be specialists from the Precious Metals Crime Task Force, a federal unit Marcus hadn't known existed until that morning. Patricia Hoffman met them at the warehouse entrance with a folder containing every document she'd assembled over the past months. Marcus's property deed, evidence of his legitimate purchase of the warehouse, her research into Harrison Volk's business history, and a detailed legal brief arguing for Marcus's ownership rights under state and federal law. "My client is cooperating voluntarily with your investigation," she announced as the federal agents examined the vault entrance. "He discovered these assets through legitimate means on property he owns legally. We're prepared to provide complete documentation and transparency." But Mr. Riley's ownership rights must be respected throughout this process. Agent Collins nodded absently. His attention focused on the silver bars that Marcus and the federal agents were carefully removing from the vault. Each bar was photographed, weighed, and recorded before being loaded into armored trucks for transport to a secure federal facility. The process took 14 hours. Marcus watched from a distance as 30 years of Harrison Volk's life's work was catalogued and removed from the place where it had been hidden. He felt a strange mixture of relief and loss—relief that the secret was finally public, loss that the treasure which had given his life new meaning was no longer under his control. But as the last armored truck disappeared into the evening, Agent Collins approached Marcus with news that would reshape his understanding of everything that had happened. "Mr. Riley, our investigation into Harrison Volk's business activities has concluded. After 3 years of investigation, we found no evidence of criminal activity. Volk was a legitimate businessman who got caught up in a broader investigation targeting money laundering in the precious metals industry." Marcus blinked. He was innocent completely. His business records show consistent, legal purchases from private sellers over 32 years. Every transaction was documented, every source verified. The FBI investigation that spooked him was based on informant reports that later proved to be false. Patricia Hoffman spoke up. "What does that mean for my client's ownership claim?" Agent Collins consulted a thick folder of documents. "The Treasury Department has concluded that all silver found in the vault was legally acquired by Harrison Volk through legitimate business transactions. Since Volk died intestate with no heirs, and since Mr. Riley is the legal owner of the property where the silver was discovered, the federal government recognizes his claim to the assets. All of them, subject to federal taxes on the value of the find, of course." Marcus sat down hard on a wooden crate, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Agent Collins had just told him. After months of fear, investigation, and threats from criminal organizations, the federal government was confirming that the silver was his. "What about the people who broke into my warehouse?" Agent Collins's expression darkened. "That's a separate matter. We've identified the organization responsible, a criminal enterprise that believed Volk had been holding assets for them. They were wrong, but they're still facing federal charges for armed robbery, conspiracy, and racketeering." Over the next several months, Marcus worked with a team of lawyers, accountants, and financial advisors to manage his newfound wealth. The tax implications were staggering: nearly $90 million owed to federal and state governments. But even after taxes, Marcus retained enough to transform not just his own life, but the lives of hundreds of others. The solution came to him while walking through the empty warehouse where his journey had begun. The building felt different without the silver vault beneath his feet, but it still carried the weight of possibility. Marcus realized that Harrison Volk's true legacy wasn't the treasure he'd accumulated, it was the principle he'd represented. That honest work and patient accumulation could build something permanent and meaningful. Marcus decided to build something permanent and meaningful of his own. Working with architects, contractors, and veterans advocates, Marcus began transforming his warehouse into something unprecedented. The Volk Center for Veteran Enterprise, a combination training facility, business incubator, and manufacturing center designed specifically for disabled veterans transitioning to civilian careers. The main warehouse floor became a state-of-the-art workshop where veterans could learn trades, precision, machining, welding, electronics, computer programming, 3D printing, and advanced manufacturing techniques. The former vault space was expanded and converted into secure storage for valuable equipment and materials, but the real innovation was the business model itself. Veterans didn't just train at the center, they built companies there. Marcus provided startup capital, mentorship, and access to markets through his growing network of contacts. The goal wasn't charity, it was empowerment, giving veterans the tools and resources they needed to build successful businesses and meaningful careers. The center's first class consisted of 37 veterans ranging in age from 23 to 64. Some were learning to program computers, others were mastering precision metalworking. Still others were developing business plans for companies they'd dreamed of starting since leaving the military. Marcus moved among them not as a benefactor, but as a fellow veteran who understood the challenges of finding purpose after service. His prosthetic leg no longer slowed him down. If anything, it connected him more deeply to the people he served. Proof that wounds didn't have to define limitations. Sarah Martinez was one of the center's first success stories. A former army mechanic who'd lost her left arm to an IED in Iraq. She'd struggled for 3 years to find civilian employment that utilized her skills and accommodated her disability. At the Volk Center, she learned advanced manufacturing techniques and started a business producing custom prosthetic components for other disabled veterans. Marcus didn't just give me training, Sarah said during the center's first anniversary celebration. He gave me back my future. He showed me that what I'd lost didn't define what I could still build. David Thompson, a former Marine sergeant with PTSD, used the center's computer programming training to start a cybersecurity consulting firm that specialized in protecting veterans' organizations from online threats. His company grew from a one-man operation to a team of 15 employees within 18 months. The center doesn't just teach skills, David explained to a reporter from the Regional Business Journal. It teaches you that you matter, that your service meant something, and that you can still make a difference in the world. By the center's second anniversary, it had graduated 143 veterans into new careers or successful businesses. The local unemployment rate among disabled veterans dropped from 22% to less than 5%. The warehouse district, once abandoned and forgotten, began attracting new businesses and investment, as the center's success created a ripple effect throughout the community. But perhaps the most important transformation was in Marcus himself. The broken soldier who'd bought a warehouse as a place to disappear had become a community leader, an entrepreneur, and a beacon of hope for veterans struggling with the same demons that had nearly destroyed him. Marcus still lived in the warehouse, though his quarters had been expanded into a comfortable apartment that overlooked the training floor. He liked being close to the work, close to the veterans whose lives were being transformed in the same space where his own transformation had begun. On quiet evenings after the last student had gone home, Marcus would walk through the center and think about the journey that had brought him here. The silver that Harrison Volk had accumulated through 30 years of patient work had become something far more valuable than precious metal. It had become opportunity, hope, and purpose for hundreds of people who'd served their country and deserved the chance to serve it again in new ways. Sometimes Marcus would remember the federal agents who'd stood above the hidden vault, searching for evidence of crimes that had never been committed, or the criminal organizations who'd believed they could steal what didn't belong to them, or the nights he'd lain awake wondering if his discovery would destroy his life rather than save it. But most often, he thought about Harrison Volk, the silver ghost, who'd spent decades building a fortune only to abandon it when federal investigators made his life unbearable. Marcus wondered what Harrison would think of what his treasure had become. Not a hoard of precious metal locked away in darkness, but a foundation that lifted others toward the light. The silver itself was long gone, converted into cash and then into infrastructure, equipment, and opportunity. But its true value had never been in the metal, it had been in the possibility it represented. The chance to transform one man's life work into something that could change hundreds of lives. Marcus had learned that treasure isn't found, it's built. One choice at a time, one day at a time, one person at a time. He'd discovered his true wealth not in a vault beneath his feet, but in the purpose he'd found serving others. The warehouse no longer echoed with emptiness. It rang with the sound of machinery and conversation, with laughter and learning, and the quiet satisfaction of meaningful work. Veterans who'd felt lost and forgotten found direction and community. Families that had struggled financially found stability and hope. And Marcus Riley, the disabled veteran who'd spent his last $8,500 on a forgotten warehouse, had become living proof that sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of something greater. 3 years after his discovery, Marcus was invited to speak at a national conference for veteran entrepreneurs. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience of business leaders, government officials, and fellow veterans, he reflected on the journey that had brought him there. 3 years ago, I was a broken man, living in an empty warehouse, he began. I'd lost my leg, my career, and my sense of purpose. I bought that building because I needed somewhere to hide from a world that didn't seem to have room for damaged soldiers. The audience was silent, listening intently. What I found there wasn't just silver, it was a reminder that some things are worth more than their market value. Harrison Volk spent 32 years building a fortune through honest work and careful planning. When he was forced to abandon it, that fortune waited in the darkness until someone could give it new purpose. Marcus paused, thinking of the veterans working in his warehouse at that very moment, building businesses and rebuilding their lives. We talk a lot about finding treasure, as if valuable things are just lying around waiting for us to stumble across them. But real treasure isn't found, it's created. It's built through service to others, through giving people the tools they need to succeed, through proving that everyone deserves a second chance. The applause was thunderous, but Marcus barely heard it. His mind was already on the drive home, on the warehouse where tomorrow's class would begin learning new skills, on the veterans who would walk through those doors carrying the same wounds and doubts he'd once carried. Marcus Riley had found $230 million in silver beneath his warehouse floor. But his greatest discovery had been much simpler and far more valuable. The understanding that true wealth isn't measured by what you can accumulate, but by what you can give away. The man who'd once felt forgotten by the world had created a place where no one had to feel forgotten again. Because sometimes the greatest fortunes aren't buried in the ground, they're built in the hearts and hands and hopes of people who refuse to give up on each other. Anyone can uncover hidden treasure if they're brave enough to break through the floor and generous enough to share what they find. As the morning sun streamed through the skylights of the Volk Center for Veteran Enterprise, Marcus Riley stood in the center of what had once been an empty warehouse, and was now a thriving symbol of second chances and renewed purpose. He no longer counted his wealth in silver bars or bank balances, but in the veterans who walked taller, the businesses that flourished, and the community that had grown around a simple belief that everyone deserves the chance to rebuild, to matter, to serve. The man who had once felt forgotten by the world had created a place where no one had to feel forgotten again. Because sometimes the greatest fortunes aren't the ones we find buried in the ground, they're the ones we build together. One person, one opportunity, one transformed life at a time. Marcus had discovered that true treasure isn't measured in what you can keep, but in what you can give away. And in giving away Harrison Volk's silver, he had gained something far more valuable, a legacy worth sharing, a purpose worth living for, and the knowledge that sometimes broken things, broken buildings, broken dreams, broken people can become the foundation for something magnificent. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories of ordinary people finding extraordinary purpose. Click to continue your journey with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe the best discoveries happen when we choose to dig deeper and lift others higher. Marcus spent the next month working with Patricia and Eleanor to organize Harrison's documentation. What they found was extraordinary. 32 years of meticulous record-keeping, every purchase documented, every source verified, every transaction recorded in Harrison's careful handwriting. The man had been more than a metals dealer, he'd been an archivist of his own success, documenting not just what he'd bought, but where it came from, who had owned it, and why they were selling. Many of the items had stories. A tea service sold by a widow to pay for her husband's funeral, a collection of silver dollars inherited by a family who needed cash for medical bills, candlesticks brought to America by immigrants and passed down through generations. Harrison hadn't just accumulated wealth, he'd preserved history, one piece at a time. Armed with this documentation, Patricia filed the necessary paperwork with the IRS, declaring the full value of the discovery and arranging for the payment of federal taxes. The bill was staggering, nearly $80 million. But Marcus had enough silver to cover it, and still have enough left over to change everything. The FBI agents returned twice more, but each time they left empty-handed. Patricia had advised Marcus to be fully cooperative, sharing Harrison's documentation and explaining the legitimate sources of the silver. Gradually, it became clear that the federal investigation was winding down with no charges filed. Harrison Volk's instincts had been right. He'd been investigated not because he was guilty, but because he was successful during a time when success in the metals business was unusual. His methods had been legal, his sources legitimate, his record-keeping exemplary. The only thing he'd been guilty of was being careful with his money and private about his business. As spring arrived, Marcus found himself facing a choice that 6 months earlier would have been unimaginable. After taxes, he would have approximately $150 million in silver and cash, enough to live comfortably for several lifetimes. But comfort wasn't what he wanted anymore. During the long winter months of research and planning, Marcus had rediscovered something he'd lost in Afghanistan: purpose. He'd seen too many veterans struggling with the same demons that had nearly destroyed him. Purposelessness, isolation, the feeling that their best days were behind them. The disability system helped with medical needs and basic survival, but it couldn't restore what military service had taken away: the sense of being part of something important, something larger than yourself. Marcus decided to build something that could. Working with Eleanor and a team of architects and contractors, he began transforming the warehouse into something unprecedented: a combination training center, workshop, and business incubator specifically designed for disabled veterans. The main floor became a state-of-the-art manufacturing facility where veterans could learn trades: metalworking, woodworking, electronics, computer programming. The vault, once cleaned out and expanded, became a secure storage area for valuable equipment and materials. But the real innovation was the business model. Veterans didn't just train at the center, they started companies there. Marcus provided startup capital, mentorship, and access to markets through his growing network of contacts. The goal wasn't charity, it was empowerment. Marcus kept enough silver to fund the operation and ensure his own financial security. But the majority of Harrison Volk's treasure was converted into something more valuable: opportunity for others. The Volk Center for Veteran Enterprise opened on a warm June morning, 6 months after Marcus had first broken through the concrete floor. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was attended by over 200 people, including veterans from 3 states, local government officials, and a reporter from the regional newspaper who'd gotten wind of the story. Marcus stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd, wearing a suit for the first time since his discharge from the army. His prosthetic leg was hidden beneath his trousers, but he no longer cared who knew about it. 6 months ago, I was a disabled veteran, with no prospects and no future, he began. I bought this warehouse with my last $8,500 because I had nowhere else to go. What I found here wasn't just treasure, it was a reminder that sometimes our biggest discoveries happen when we stop looking for them and start building something worth finding. He paused, looking at the faces in the crowd, young veterans with fresh wounds and old veterans carrying decades of invisible scars, all of them searching for what he'd found: purpose. Harrison Volk spent 32 years building a fortune through honest work and patient accumulation. He hid it away not out of shame, but because he understood that some things are too valuable to trust to chance. Today, we're taking that treasure and turning it into something even more valuable: opportunity for those who've served their country and deserve the chance to serve it again in new ways. The center's first class consisted of 23 veterans, ranging in age from 24 to 67. Some were learning to program computers, others were mastering precision metalworking. Still others were developing business plans for companies they'd always dreamed of starting. Marcus moved among them not as a boss or benefactor, but as a fellow traveler who'd found his way from darkness to light. His prosthetic leg no longer slowed him down. If anything, it connected him more deeply to the people he served, proof that wounds didn't have to define limitations. By the center's first anniversary, it had graduated 87 veterans into new careers or successful businesses. The local unemployment rate among disabled veterans dropped from 18% to less than 4%. The warehouse district, once abandoned and forgotten, began attracting new businesses and investment. But the most important transformation was in Marcus himself. The broken soldier who'd bought a warehouse as a place to hide had become a leader, an entrepreneur, a beacon of hope for others who felt abandoned by the world. He still lived in the warehouse, though his quarters had been expanded and improved considerably. He liked being close to the work, close to the people whose lives were being transformed in the same space where his own transformation had begun. On quiet evenings, Marcus would walk through the training floor after the last student had gone home. The spaces that had once held millions of dollars in hidden silver now contained something more valuable: the tools and equipment that were building new lives, new careers, new futures. Sometimes he would think about Harrison Volk, the silver ghost who'd spent 3 decades accumulating wealth and then walked away from it rather than compromise his integrity. Marcus wondered what Harrison would think of what his treasure had become: not a fortune hoarded in darkness, but a foundation for lifting others toward the light. The silver itself was long gone, converted into cash, then into infrastructure, equipment, and opportunity. But its true value had never been in the metal, it had been in the possibility it represented: the chance to transform one person's careful work into something that could change hundreds of lives. Marcus had learned that treasure isn't found, it's built, one choice at a time, one day at a time, one person at a time. He'd discovered his treasure not in a vault beneath his feet, but in the purpose he'd found in serving others. The warehouse no longer echoed with emptiness. It rang with the sound of hammers and lathes, computer keyboards and welding torches, laughter and conversation, and the quiet satisfaction of meaningful work. Marcus Riley had bought a building for $8,500 and found a treasure worth $230 million. But the greatest discovery wasn't the silver, it was himself, and the understanding that sometimes losing everything is just the first step toward finding what really matters. Anyone can uncover hidden treasure if they're brave enough to break through the floor and generous enough to share what they find. As the morning sun streamed through the skylights of the Volk Center, Marcus Riley stood in the center of what had once been an empty warehouse and was now a thriving symbol of second chances. He no longer counted his wealth in silver bars or bank balances, but in the veterans who walked taller, the businesses that flourished, and the community that had grown around a simple belief that everyone deserves the chance to rebuild, to matter, to serve. The man who had once felt forgotten by the world had created a place where no one had to feel forgotten again. Because sometimes the greatest fortunes aren't the ones we find buried in the ground. They're the ones we build together. One person, one opportunity, one transformed life at a time. Marcus had discovered that true treasure isn't measured in what you can keep, but in what you can give away. And in giving away Harrison Volk's silver, he had gained something far more valuable. A legacy worth sharing. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories of ordinary people finding extraordinary purpose. Click to continue your journey with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe the best discoveries happen when we choose to dig deeper and lift others higher.